Today we're going to be taking this mismatched pair and making them look somewhat cohesive, even though they are two completely different styles, one being a little bit more country, one being a little bit more art deco. I think I can make them look a little bit more similar. Today I'm going to be working on these two dressers here. They are getting a similar look. They're getting painted in a off-white, kind of like beigey neutral color. And then we're going to be whitewashing the drawer fronts as well as the tops. They're both commission pieces for the same client. So I'm excited to get working on them and give her exactly what she wants. So I'm going to get to stripping this piece. This is the one I'm going to work on first because I'm most excited to get these drawers stripped down. This one is going to be a little bit more difficult, so I will do that one next. But I'm going to focus on this one. For what I do to strip, I just use the Clean Strip stripper. They only had the sprayable one at my store, so I grabbed that, but normally I just get the other one. And I just keep the same old stripping brush. This has been used so many times. It's cheap. It was like a few bucks at the hardware store, and this is just the one I use with my stripper all the time. It hardens up, but then once you put the stripper on it, it like reactivates it. So instead of wasting chip brushes, I stick to this one. And some 4.0 steel wool. So let's get started. Before I did anything, I removed the hardware and put them aside since I will be sanding them down and giving them the same whitewash technique I'm giving to the drawer fronts. Even though I really dislike the mess of a chemical stripper, I don't like burning through veneer even more. So in this case, I opted to use chemical stripper. I let that sit for a few minutes, about 10 to 15. I scraped it all off and then I followed everything up with some acetone and steel wool. It just helps remove any additional stain as well as all the residue from the chemical stripper. The finish on the top of the dresser was failing in a lot of spots, so I knew I could remove a lot of it with my carbide scraper. Anything remaining, I just scrubbed away with my steel wool and acetone. Once the drawer fronts were all dry out front, I went ahead and just sanded everything by hand, again, being very sure not to sand through any of this beautiful veneer. At one point in time, this dresser had a matching mirror or something that went on top, and I needed to do something about those holes. Luckily, I had some wooden dowels that fit it perfectly, so I glued them in, cut them off, and sanded it smooth. The drawer fronts and the top of the dresser were getting a paint wash. The body was getting painted. And in order to make sure your paint adheres really well, you want to make sure your surface is totally clean of any residue, grease, or grime. Use your favorite degreaser followed by a good rinse. Once everything's clean and dry, you can go into sanding. This piece has had a lot of use in the past, so there were lots of dings and dents all over the place. Sometimes I choose to keep a few to add a little bit of character to the piece, but I wanted to have this one mostly smooth. I went in with my Surf Prep sander. I used a 120 and then a 180 grit to make sure everything was nice and smooth. I like to do a 120 followed by a 180 just to make sure the 120 knocks away any dents and then the 180 smooths everything out. If I'm sanding a piece down to bare wood, I'll typically start with a 100 followed by 120 and then 180. I don't like to go much higher than that because the higher you go, the more the grain closes and then the stain doesn't take as well to the piece of wood. But before I get to priming this piece, I had to tape off the top. And I don't know about you, but I always struggle with this tape and plastic. It starts sticking to itself, and then I usually just roll it up in a ball and throw it across the room. For both of these pieces, I took the hardware off, I sanded them down off camera, and then did the same paint wash technique I did to the drawers to the hardware. This one was a little bit more dirty than the other, so I went ahead and scrubbed it with my little drill cleaner attachment. I love that thing so much. And then I gave the inside a really good wipe down because it was very, very dusty. I already knew that this piece would be a bleeder, but this just proved that I would need to prime it very well. Just like the other dresser, I scuff sanded this one really smooth so that I could go on to priming. Because this piece is getting painted in a light color and I knew this piece was a bleeder, I opted to use a shellac base primer. The one I'm using is by Sherwin-Williams. It's a really great dupe for the bin shellac and it's actually a couple bucks cheaper. Once the primer was dry, I got my paint ready. For this project, I'm using the Bare Urethane Alkyd Enamel in the color Studio Clay. I grabbed this one in the satin sheen, which is what I normally use. Occasionally I'll use a matte or a flat, but usually I pick satin. I always add a little bit of water to my paint to make sure it comes out of my sprayer nice. Usually I do about 10 to 15%. Now it's really important if you're using a sprayer to make sure that the settings are perfect. If you have the flow open too much, you'll get too much paint at once and that can lead to drips and sagging. And if you have it too little, you're not going to get good enough coverage. Since it's really cold right now where I live, I did one coat, I let that dry overnight, and then the next day I went in with a sanding pad. I get them from Amazon. It's like a really high grit. I want to say around 400. And I just go over everything nice and smooth to make sure any kind of dust particles or any kind of hard pieces that might have gotten in my paint are smoothed out. Once you're happy with everything, you can go in with your second coat. Lately, I've been really into using either an alkyd or a urethane type paint, a cabinet and trim paint, because they don't need a top coat. They dry really hard, similar to an oil-based paint. But they're water-based, so it's an easy cleanup. For the drawers, I used the same paint mixed with a little bit of water and did a paint wash over everything. Before going in with my paint wash, I always like to mist the surface or just dampen it a little bit so that it acts kind of like a pre-stain would. That way I can kind of maneuver my paint wash a little bit better. I was kind of going for like a ASMR type of video here, but I can hear myself breathing through my respirator and it's irking me so bad, so apologies. But I guess now's a good time to remind you that if you are doing things like painting or stripping furniture, you always want to wear the appropriate PPE. When I do a paint wash, I take a paintbrush and I go with the grain over the whole surface. I let it sit for a couple seconds, maybe 10 seconds, 20 seconds, and then I carefully wipe away any of the leftover paint. You want to be very careful not to leave any marks from your paper towel or rag, and you can always do a second coat once the first coat has dried. Just remember to always wipe with the grain. And if you see a rag or a towel mark, keep wiping because that will dry that way and you'll never be able to get rid of it. Like I mentioned, you can choose to do a second coat or you can let this dry and then add your top coat. My favorite top coat is the Varathane water-based satin poly. For this top, instead of using a watered down paint, I opted to use this Dixie Belle stain. It's a little bit thicker and I knew it would help camouflage the color difference a little bit more. Water-based stain can be a little bit difficult to work with because it dries so fast. If you're finding that you have that problem, do the same thing I did with the paint wash and wet the surface before you apply the stain. And you can also mix the stain with a little bit of Floetrol. It will just give you a little bit more working time. Once everything was paint washed, including the hardware, I let it dry overnight, went in with a water-based satin poly, let that dry, and here's how we ended up. While these pieces came to me and they were not a matching set, I did my best to make them look pretty similar. These two dressers are completely different. One's more country, one's more art deco, modern, but with the same color and the same paint wash, they kind of look like they belong together. They might not be twins, but I guess we can call them distant cousins, once removed. Even though they might not be exactly the same, I'm still loving how they both turned out. Either way, together or not, I love each one so much equally. And that's exactly what I tell my children too. If you're looking for any of the products I used today, I will have them in the description down below. But that's it for today. Thanks for watching.